So my title is Advent Hope, Foundations for a Hopeful Ecclesiology, or alternate title, I gave it Foundations for a Hopeful Hermeneutic. My bio, as Lauren mentioned, part of my story is there and back again, to borrow a Tolkien phrase. I was raised Adventist in New Haven, Connecticut, Terre Haute, Indiana, Rockford, Illinois. Went to AUC in the summer of 1980, just as our dean of our theology department, chair of our theology department, Dean Davis, was coming back from Glacier View. So those were the times, but AUC was not caught up in the theological controversy like Southern and some other places were at the time. I, though, was reading a lot of church history and contemporary polemics. Was especially appreciative of the ministry of people like Des Ford and Morris Venden, those who gave a more gospel-oriented approach to Adventism. I was also connected with people like Bob Brinsmead. I got dialoguing with him, some questions, doing some research on his background, and found his attitude appealing. You know, that grief that you feel, as one of my professors identified it, with that sense of loss, that sense of betrayal. And I resonated with Bob's anger that caused him to reach out. And, you know, he had a series of publications, Sabbatarianism Reexamined, 1844 Reexamined, playing upon the Wieland title, and really taking a hard look. And we had people like Des and Walter Ray came to South Lancaster, heard them there. But the bottom line was, at the end of my junior year in 1983, I left the Adventist church. Just did not feel there was anything there for me, and had a lot of anger and as I say, grief. I'd gotten married a year before to Joy Cheney. Her father, Reg, was a longtime pastor in the Northern New England Conference. Little did she know what kind of an adventure I was going to lead her on. I went to see one of my professors, Tim Barry, for counseling, to help get in touch with, you know, what my feelings were and the feelings that I was getting from some other people. And he was the one who named this grief with those symptoms of anger, depression, loss, sadness, etc. And through his influence, I decided to just take my time. I finished up at AUC. And then didn't want to just go off in a totally new direction. I applied to a number of grad schools, and Loma Linda offered me a teaching assistantship. Paul Landa was the chair of the church history department on the La Sierra campus, which was still part of Loma Linda University at the time. And Paul didn't care that I had left the Adventist church. He says, "Hey, I want to study with you. I want you to study with me." And so I did my first year of graduate school with him, and had classes from people like Rick Rice and Paul Landa, Charles Teal, Rennie Shefflin, and Rennie got me writing for Spectrum for the first time back then. And I was helping Paul teach the undergraduate church history survey, and helping him to edit Adventist Heritage. And that was a good experience for me, in a very accepting environment. And so I really love Loma Linda and La Sierra for that to this day. And I'm grateful when I can see, especially Rick Rice, at some of the theological conferences. But after a year, the dean of our School of Religion, Niels Erik Andreasen, couldn't pay me money for an assistantship. So I began looking. I was going to a Lutheran church, and I began looking for a Lutheran seminary. And Paul Landa said, "Well, if you're going to go to a Lutheran seminary, go to Gettysburg and study with Robert W. Jensen and Eric Gritch." And I did. Finished up my MA in church history there in '86, and my MDiv in '89, and was ordained by the new Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I pastored Lutheran churches in central Pennsylvania and in Vermont, and was a chaplain candidate in the Army Reserve, and then a chaplain in the Vermont National Guard. and had a traumatic first couple of churches. And the first one, it was two churches that were at each other's throat, conflict that I was not prepared for. I think every one of us pastors can agree that we got nothing in seminary about conflict management. And I also had two premature children, one the very weekend that I was called to my first church. So I was burned up and chewed up and spat out that first district in 11 months. In my church in Vermont, I followed a pastor who I found out had molested a 14-year-old girl. And my years there were spent just picking up the pieces and being the transitional person who could start dealing with some of the anger and betrayal there. So with those kind of experiences, I was just spent. And where did I find spiritual nourishment was, some of my association from some of my fellow chaplains in the Vermont National Guard, most of whom were Catholic priests. I started participating in an ecumenical Franciscan community called the Brothers and Sisters of Charity that was founded by the musician John Michael Talbot. And these were the things that led me then to, I spent the next 14 years working in lay ministry in the Catholic Church as a director of religious ed in Watertown, New York, then in campus ministry with the Paulist Fathers at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And then in 1998 was called by the then diocese, now Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, to be director of young adult and campus ministry. And I had that position for 9 years, directing about a dozen different public campus ministry programs throughout from Sam Houston State and Huntsville down to University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Rice, University of Houston, Schools of the Texas Medical Center, Prairie View, TSU, and doing young adult ministry in the churches. But I never got away from my Adventist friends, and they stayed in contact. Charles Steele's advice was, God's present in other churches, number one, and number two, don't burn your bridges. And people like Rick Trott, who was the chaplain at AUC, remained a good friend. And he had me come back from time to time to give lectures in his church history or his comparative American religions classes. And, my experiences in both those places led me to look at Adventism differently. And, there's a long story that, as John Henry Newman once said, you can't tell between the soup and the fish dish. Over a period of a few months, I had a lot of invitations from these old friends. Have you ever thought about coming back? And under those circumstances, I came back in 2007 and was immediately, after I stepped out in faith to be rebaptized and was looking for positions, and Rick Trott was reaching out to all kinds of friends to do networking. But I felt I had to kind of step out in faith. And 3 days after that, Leighton Holly, the conference president for Texas, took my family out to eat at an Olive Garden. And then in there, he offered me a call to be the associate pastor of the Houston International Church that my wife had been attending for the previous 9 years. Doug Kilcher was the executive secretary, and he'd been my father-in-law's ministerial director in Northern New England some years before. So there were people who knew of me. And what surprised me was I didn't get the third degree inquisition about where I was and where I was coming back and what my theological positions were. Leighton's approach was, we all had those questions in the 80s. Some of us just buried it and just plugged on doing the work. There was just that respect and that attitude of welcoming. And Leighton put me in touch with people like Alan Martin, who were doing young adult ministry, and Ron Piquel doing campus ministry. And I got connected with the folks at Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries who said, you really need to be back in the chaplaincy with that kind of a background. And so 2009, got back in the National Guard, deployed to Kuwait in 2013. And while I was gone, Gary Council said, how'd you like to come work for me? And I'm not going to make you move away from Texas. So since 2014, I've been the assistant director of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries. My boss is Washington Johnson, retired Navy captain who's a former editor for Message magazine. On the West Coast, we have Angela Lee, who until a couple of years ago was directing the Master of Science Chaplaincy program at Loma Linda. For the Northeast, we have Gilda Roddy, who had been one of the pastors at the Loma Linda University Church most recently. And then for the Southern Union, we have Corey Rowe, who just started in January, who had been one of the theology professors at Oakwood. So that's our team, very diverse, and we are responsible both for helping pastors make that transition into chaplaincy, or to continue to serve as pastors and be chaplains in their community. And then I'm like the ministerial director, going around visiting them, seeing how they're doing trainings for conferences on things like traumatic event management, suicide prevention became my professional focus. So that's my background in a quick. Those are the areas on the slide of the different kinds of chaplaincy I've been a part of. Military chaplain for 20 years until 2019, my campus ministry time, and I'm on the leadership team for Adventist Christian Fellowship, which is our ministry to public university students. I'm a disaster chaplain, credentialed by Adventist Community Services. I've been doing police chaplaincy as chaplain for the VA Hospital Police Department here in Houston, and I'm in my 4th unit of clinical pastoral education at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center in Houston. That picture there shows me with Dick Stenbakken, who I first heard back in the 70s at Broadview Academy, and he inspired me to be an Army chaplain. And the other side is Jonathan McGraw, who was my final boss. My last 2 years in the Army Reserve were at the Army Chief of Chaplain's office in the Strategic Initiatives Group, working for Jonathan, who's one of the most creative strategic leaders in Adventism or in the Army chaplaincy. And we had a great thing. I got to go to medical conferences and scientific conferences looking at what can we learn from them about resilience and topics like that. So that's my background. Definition, what is a chaplain? Simply a pastor who's serving in a specialized setting. And my previous boss, Paul Anderson, liked to say not all pastors are chaplains, but all chaplains are pastors. Sometimes we get from other pastors, why did you leave the ministry? Well, obviously we didn't. I tell people, I didn't leave the ministry by specializing any more than your cardiologist left the practice of medicine by becoming a specialist. We have one Adventist ministry, and I'm grateful that we're an expression of ministry where women play a very prominent role, and we've shifted in our office over the past 9 years from being all old white men to being a very diverse department with Gilda and Angela being part of our team. Some key text for me is understanding what my role as a chaplain is and the focus of our ministry. It starts with the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That we see ourselves doing that, having this incarnational ministry in the world, going out into the community. As a National Guard chaplain, I served in a battalion, 500 soldiers who represented the vast diversity of the Houston community. And I was their pastor, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Wiccan, atheist. I was there for them. And we like this passage from Ministry of Healing, where Ellen White, after talking about all the problems in the modern world, 1905 in her time, the world of the fin de siècle, as they said, this time of confusion, modernization, and she talks about suicide and crime and distress. And then she said this, that Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching the people. The Savior mingled with men as one who desired their good. He showed his sympathy for them, ministered to their needs, and won their confidence. Then he bade them, follow me. And that's what I love about chaplaincy, being able to be there with those who are hurting. And with my focus on suicide prevention and trauma response, I was invited to be part of the response after the Santa Fe High School shooting, and in El Paso after the mass shooting at the Walmart there. And being with soldiers in times of doubt, on a year-long deployment, far from home, being with people in hospitals at times of suffering without an agenda, without having an expectation of how many baptisms I need to have, or how many prophecy seminars I need to do, or how many Bible studies I should be doing, but the expectation that my ministry is to be there on the ruck march, by the hospital bed, chatting with my cops in their break room, whatever, and showing my interest in them, showing my love for them, and being available for them when they're in need. I also like in Third Selected Messages, this chapter on attending colleges and universities of the land, where Ellen White looks at the Waldenses. And here she's focusing on their ministry in the university setting. They went as students. They made no pretensions. Apparently, they paid no attention to anyone, but they lived out what they believed. And she said, those who have the Spirit of God, who have the truth wrought into their very being, should be encouraged to enter colleges and live the church as Daniel and Paul did. Let them show respect for the rules and regulations of the school and just work as leaven. And she's saying this in the 1890s, at the time that the land-grant universities are growing. And even though Adventist colleges are growing, and she did not see it as zero-sum game to be promoting attendance at public universities as well as Adventist colleges. And especially when University of Michigan opened as one of the first, along with Johns Hopkins, one of the first scientifically based medical schools, she's telling the people at Battle Creek Sanitarium, she's telling Uriah Smith's son, go to Ann Arbor and get your medical education there, without an agenda, being just part of that community and letting your example make a difference. I want to do a little, my churches all know that I'm going to get into some history. That historical background has not left. But some beginning seeds in the Adventist movement that I think can speak to us for the future. William Miller, we talk about him and we focus upon his prophecy charts and his proclamation of the end. But if you read him, you see this man who lives and breathes hope and optimism. He isn't the prophet with the sign declaring the end is near, flee from the cities, do all this stuff, or praising God for destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. He's speaking about hope. Now, here's a couple of quotes from Sylvester Bliss's biography. He opens the Bible. He says, I found the Lord God to be a rock in the midst of the ocean of life. The Bible now became my chief study, and I can truly say I searched it with great delight. I need not speak of the joy that filled my heart in view of the delightful prospect of the return of Christ. Not fear, but delight, nor the ardent longings of my soul for a participation in the joys of the redeemed. And Lauren was sharing about that. How much have we heard about fear? My first dream that I remember is like a kindergarten kid or a first grader after a prophecy sermon at church. In my dream, the Good Humor Man came. And on the back of the Good Humor Man's truck was Jesus with the angels. And he was going down the street and going faster and faster. And I was left behind. What a scary dream for a young kid to have. Instead of being filled with thoughts of the love of Jesus. And at the end of the disappointment, Miller's hope never wavered. And you may have heard this quote in one of his letters shortly afterwards, in December of 1844. I have fixed my mind on another time, and there I mean to stand until God gives me more light. And that is today, today, and today until he comes. This eager expectation and longing. Now, Miller was not one who abandoned the world, though. There's another side to him that we don't really pay attention to. Okay, well, first, I'm a slide ahead of myself. He was very much against creeds. We must then either let our brethren have the freedom of thought, opinion, and speech, or must resort to creeds and formulas. Bishops and popes, I see no other alternative. So his movement was filled with Christian connection, folks who were Arian in their Christology, and with Methodists, and with people of so many other different backgrounds who had so many different views on so many areas of theology. But he said what unites us is our hope in the coming of Jesus. Now here, how is Miller being viewed by the world? Well, here's William Lloyd Garrison writing of Miller in 1843. His character is particularly odious to the selfish conservatism of the day on account of his hearty espousal of the great radical reforms which are now shaking the land. The cause of temperance, of anti-slavery, of moral reform, of non-resistance finds in him an outspoken friend. So I think Miller really paid attention to Jesus. One of the sermons I give is talk about Jesus' eschatological discourse, and the disciples ask him about the signs of the end, and he gives Matthew 24, but then Jesus says, don't really pay attention to that, and he gives then this parables in Matthew 25, being like the wise virgins, having that oil in your lamp, being ready for whatever, and then the parable of the sheep and the goats, saying this is what we're to be doing now while we're waiting, is doing the ministry of Jesus, tending to those who are sick, those who are ill, those who are naked, those who are in prison, those who are the xenos, the foreigners, showing our compassion to them as to Jesus Christ. Non-resistance, Garrison says. Garrison, among other things, founded the New England Non-Resistance Society. Non-resistance meant nonviolence. We didn't have the word pacifism until about 1900, when that was coined by a French radical. In the 19th century, the term that was used for nonviolence was non-resistance, that we're not resisting evil. That was used by the Anabaptists, that was used by the Quakers. And of course, the Quakers were part of the abolitionist movement and had great influence upon it, including upon Garrison. At one point, a mob was going to take him down, and somebody wanted to pull out his gun and go to Garrison's aid. And he said, no, I'm going to be consistent in my principles. We can't turn to violence to promote the cause of justice and peace. And I'm not going to defend myself, nor am I going to let anybody else fight for me. And so Miller, who was this military man who gets shocked by this shell that lands near, kills many of his men, doesn't touch him, and that sends him to the Bible. So that strain of Adventism, of nonviolence, it's present right there at the beginning in the person of Miller and of Joshua V. Himes, who was the co-founder of the New England Non-Resistance Society together with Garrison. So Miller did, and Joseph Bates, who was chair of some of the anti-slavery conventions, John Byington, conductor on the Underground Railroad, we remember that piece. These folks didn't see a distinction or a contradiction between looking for the coming of Jesus and paying attention to the social needs of their day. This anti-creedalism also comes into the early Sabbatarian Adventist movement. Word to the little flock. The Bible is a perfect and complete revelation. It's our only rule of faith and practice. James White, 1853, we want no human creed. The Bible is sufficient. It's the will of the Lord that his people should be called away from confusion and the bondage of man-made creeds to enjoy the oneness and freedom of the gospel. Making a creed, 1861, is setting the stakes and barring up the way to all future advancement. And he says it's contradictory to our belief in the perpetuity of spiritual gifts. Because what if God leads us to something in the Spirit, through the Spirit, and we've nailed down our stakes on a particular doctrine, and the Spirit is saying, no, look at these other texts, go in this other direction. He found that to be contradictory. Ellen White picked this up. The Bible and the Bible alone is to be our creed, the sole bond of union. Our own views and ideas must not control our efforts. Man is fallible, but God's word is infallible. Instead of wrangling with one another, let men exalt the Lord. And she said that throughout her life. In 1872, though, the Brethren finally got their first statement of principles, but they did it with this caution. In presenting to the public the synopsis of our faith, we wish to have it distinctly understood that we have no articles of faith, creed, or discipline aside from the Bible. We do not put forth this as having any authority with our people, nor is it designed to secure uniformity among them as a system of faith, but as a brief statement of what is and has been with great unanimity held by them. It's on 1831 or 1931, we get a more fully developed statement of fundamental beliefs that doesn't have that preface. And that's then published in our first church manual in 1932, which gives us this baptismal questionnaire where you have to be examined. Do you believe this, that, and the other thing, all the way down the list? At that point, how can we say we don't have a creed? What is creed? Credo, I believe. And the creeds, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, grew out of statements of affirmation of the faith that you made before you can be baptized. So the minute that we have a statement of faith requiring assent before you can be baptized, we have a creed. And so we've gone quite a way at that point. Now, here's another very unusual statement that we hear from James White that expresses that openness and is contrast to much of later Adventism. This is published in Third Spiritual Gifts, so it's always been there in front of us, but we haven't noticed it. We object to that narrow-souled theology, which will not allow the old ladies to have dreams, because the prophecy says, your old men shall dream dreams. And they will not allow young women to have visions, because the prophecy says, your young men shall see visions. These stingy critics seem to forget that man and men in the scriptures generally mean both men and women. The book says that it's appointed unto men once to die. Don't women die? Unto you, O man, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. Don't the Lord call women? But the prophecy does say your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. And that's in his booklet on the perpetuity of spiritual gifts, justifying Ellen White's call to ministry. And then came the fundamentalist movement. And I really appreciate Mike Campbell for his books on the 1919 Bible Conference and this one, 1922, The Rise of Adventist Fundamentalism, showing how much things in the world transformed the church and its way of being in the world and its attitude towards theology. You know, we have this fear of other Christians, Sunday keepers, unbelievers. Oh, we shouldn't read their books. We shouldn't listen to their programs. But guess what we do? And we've been influenced by them. So we were influenced by that fundamentalist spirit that wants to nail down everything, get rid of all ambiguity. Now, you look at our health message. In the 19th century, the focus was on eat the best diet that you can. We have those things that scandalize John Harvey Kellogg, like Ellen White sending out for a can of oysters from time to time. And you look at her, and she's never quoting Leviticus 11 and saying these are rules to go by. She's saying eat healthy. And God said, gave us permission to eat meat after the flood. But, she focused on the pig being a dirty animal as the basis for not eating it. But after the 20s, we start focusing on a legalistic interpretation of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. But even in the 50s, in questions on doctrine, you look at the chapter there about clean and unclean foods, and Reed and Froome, etc. They said, we don't go to Leviticus 11 as to taboos and rules. Our focus is on health. And we look to these things as guidelines that if God said, avoid these things, he must have had a good reason. So health is our focus. But today the emphasis is upon we can't eat this list, and it's a do's and don'ts, and we forget the emphasis upon health often. I even had one church member who blocked me on Facebook because she was saying you can't eat ducks because ducks are unclean. And I said, well, they aren't mentioned in Leviticus, and the Jewish tradition has never seen ducks as unclean. And she posted this meme that had ducks in a picture and said, well, this is right, and who cares what the Jewish tradition says about what's clean and unclean. But you look at recently, how many of our folks get their views of eschatology from our Adventist traditions, and how many have been influenced by fundamentalism? I have so many Adventists who are Zionists and who think the return of Israel of Judaism and the establishment of the modern state of Israel are a sign of the end, something that is not mentioned anywhere in Adventist, in historic Adventist prophetic interpretation. We look at the headship theology, something that and complementarianism that is developed in the late 20th century within evangelicalism and then imported into Adventism. So we've been influenced by these other movements. I like to point out that in Pathfinders, we learned to keep the morning watch. We got that from elsewhere. We got that from John Mott and his Volunteer Mission Society, even the concept of missionary volunteers. And it was John Mott, the YMCA leader and ecumenist, who established the idea of keeping the morning watch by having a little booklet with a little prayer and a very short devotional to start the day. So we've never been afraid of borrowing stuff from other people. Now, here's a couple of quotes from a modern theologian on this idea of hope. This is from Jürgen Moltmann, his book, Theology of Hope on the Ground and the Implications of a Christian Eschatology. I think it was about 1967. Christianity is eschatology. It is hope, forward-looking and forward-moving, and therefore also revolutionizing and transforming the present. If we have this hope for the future, it has to influence how we're living and acting today. He says that's why faith, wherever it develops into hope, causes not rest, but unrest, not patience, but impatience. It does not calm the unquiet heart, but is itself this unquiet heart in man. Those who hope in Christ can no longer put up with reality as it is, but begin to suffer under it, to contradict it. Peace with God meets conflict with the world, for the goal of the promised future stabs inexorably into the flesh of every unfulfilled present. See, that's what I see in William Miller. That's what I see in those early Adventists. They have that eschatological hope, but that hope is transforming the present, that the Christ who's coming, who's going to break the shackles of slavery, well, that kingdom is in breaking now and calling us to act for the freedom of other people. It was Charles Teal who first pointed me to this statement by Martin Luther King Jr. in his Nobel acceptance speech. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. So when I'm tempted to despair, when I look at the politics, especially here in Texas, I'm glad that Houston and our other cities are islands in the midst of the islands of light in the midst of the darkness of the politics of our state capital, that we can't let go of that hope, that hope can transform, that by our actions in the world around us, we can make a difference. So these were kind of the background of in the essay that I wrote for Spectrum a year and a half ago. this was behind it. Because I listened to this sermon by a church leader of 14 points of fear and said, there's got to be something other than this. This is not my Adventist faith. It's not one of fear. It is one of optimism. It is one of a contagious joy, of believing that we can make a difference, that the second coming of Jesus is one of healing, of wiping away tears, of healing all our pain and uniting us to him, that it is a joyful thing. It is the blessed hope. That the Jesus that we look to is one who knows our temptations, our weakness, our suffering, our trauma, our grief, and that is the one who stands as our advocate representing us to the Father so we can come boldly to the throne of grace. What does the New Testament say about the high priesthood of Jesus? That's what it says about it, that it is not a reason to fear like in Uriah Smith. Oh, he's been going on in this investigative judgment for 44 years. How much longer can it take? We need to be ready that our name could come up at any time in the book of judgment. But that's not what Hebrews says. We can go boldly into the throne of grace. The third point for me was an affirmation of the confession of the Trinity. We've struggled with that as Adventism, and we still do. There's people who want to recover the Arianism. There's others who flee to that and embrace a kind of tritheism, where Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three members of the celestial committee. Others seem drawn towards adoptionism. Jesus is a man who gets adopted by God, or other things. But I, for one, am comfortable with the Christology and theology, the Trinitarianism of the Apostles and Nicene creeds that were meant not to swallow up Greek philosophy, but using the terms of Greek philosophy to speak of biblical relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We have this hope because of Matthew 25. He's called us to live in this kingdom way while we wait for him, healing the sick, visiting the imprisoned, clothing the naked, welcoming the immigrant, and going to those most in need. I'm going backwards. Going ahead myself too much. Verse 4, he came to preach the gospel, forgive sins, restoring us to fellowship with him to usher in the coming kingdom. Point 5, that baptism forgives us our sins, brings us to feast at this table. And that image of the table is, for me, the most important image of the church, where he invites everybody, where some say, oh, I can't go, or I've got this excuse. And he says, well, go out into the highways and byways and to compel them to come in. You look at the stories of Jesus' feasts, and there's always some of those saying, well, that person shouldn't be here. That person shouldn't be doing that. The disciples are so often setting themselves as gatekeepers to keep people from Jesus, and Jesus is constantly rebuking them and saying, let them come to me. We have this hope because the church is that continuity of the meals that he had with outcasts, the excluded, the sinners, the poor, those of ill repute, the rough, the scandalous, all of whom he embraced in love. We have this hope because he's called to live in that kingdom way. He's called us to be a prophetic people, able to both proclaim his coming and to live his justice, liberating those enslaved, aiding their journey to freedom and wholeness. He's called us to be a people who heal. That transformation in the early church, Ellen White, she starts out by criticizing the medicine of her day, which was, leeches, bloodletting, mercury. But then by the 1890s, she's telling people, hey, we've got these new scientific medical schools. Go there, learn. And we set up Loma Linda soon thereafter. And Loma Linda, within a few years, got the A rating from the newly established American Medical Association. That commitment that we're going to connect both our passion for healing and our mercy and that distrust of some of these remedies, but a holistic emphasis that is also able to embrace science. And what a wonderful gift. I wrote this at the time in the middle of the pandemic. It would be if we could give to the world in a time of pandemic, if we mobilized all our forces to teach the value of vaccines and open vaccine clinics in all of our churches to help bring it to an end. And some of our churches, especially in the regional conferences, did that. Whereas others were talking about religious liberty and so on, and saying that's why you shouldn't have to wear a mask. Number 10, we have this hope because Jesus, who's coming, is the one through whom all things were made, that we rejoice in this creation and we honor and respect this gift, seeking to nurture and care for it as Adam and Eve were called to do. And, I think of those great statements that were made on the reality and the concerns for issues like climate change 20 years ago. The Adventist Church, I think, was one of the earliest to say we need to care for the environment. We need to address the issues of climate change. That was when a different wind was blowing in some corners. Number 11, we have this hope because we're citizens of his kingdom, called to live the values of the Sermon on the Mount, called to separate ourselves from beastly powers and institutions, especially those religious entities that seek worldly power through alliances with corrupt politicians to create their version of a pseudo-religious state. We're called to renounce power, to reject violence, to lay down arms, to abandon all systems of privilege, to be a prophetic remnant of peace. And how often have we seen so much of, especially white middle-class Adventism, embracing the darker politics of the last few years? How often have we seen talks on religious liberty shifting from our historic concern about Christians trying to unite with beastly power to instead encouraging people to see this is our hope, that we need the politicians. We don't care if they're Christians or not. We need them to bring back prayer in public schools. We need them to give money to Christian schools. We need them to enforce biblical morality. And how many Adventists have we seen embracing that vision and forgetting our historic commitment to strict separation of church and state? 12, we have this hope because we see throughout history God's faithfulness. In every era of the great controversy, we see people of every nation holding on to different pieces of truth, seeking God, critically examining what they received, opening the Bible in expectation of an encounter with its author who promised to lead them into all truth. You can read the book, The Great Controversy, in two ways. You can focus on those chapters at the end saying, hey, this is coming. Or that thread through the whole thing of God's faithfulness in every ages. She even talks about some good Catholic movements, like the Irish monks who re-evangelized Europe after the fall of Rome. People like, and all the different reformers. I was in Zurich recently, and I took some chaplains on a tour of the Reformation sites there associated with Zwingli and Anabaptist and the Anabaptists. And one thing I'm disappointed with is that she totally ignores the Anabaptists of Zurich when talking about Zwingli. She says nothing about his creation of a theocratic state and his murder of Anabaptists who wanted to be baptized by immersion. In Delafield's book on Ellen White in Europe, he talks about her going to Zurich and wanting to see all the Zwingli sites, who was really her hero, but no mention of the Anabaptists. The only time they get mentioned is she has a couple of chapters about Menno Simons, the Anabaptist leader in the Netherlands later on. But I think there's one of our our closest cousins. And some of those who participated in the world dialogue between Adventists and the Mennonites said this was the best dialogue of any that they had, because they felt the closest spiritual kinship with them. 13, we have hope because we're part of a movement, not a corporation. A movement that crosses lines and borders and barriers, that draws together seekers of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, and we willingly collaborate in the work of the gospel with others who share our values without fear. That's what I'm able to do as a chaplain. That's what ADRA is able to do. That's what our healthcare institutions are able to do. And finally, my last point, we have this hope because the Spirit has been poured out upon us in these last days, as promised by Joel, upon old men and young women, upon young men and old women, and that the Spirit is no respecter of persons, but has given each gifts that are for the common good. And my conclusion to that essay and to this presentation, that the world is weary. It has so much need. It's hungry for an encounter with the bread of life. It's hurting, it's been traumatized, but it's been hurt by the church. It's been hurt by our churches, and it needs the great physician. Meanwhile, we wander about directionless, and we need the good shepherd. We thirst for the water of life. We long for Sabbath rest. And of all the things that Sam Bakiaki wrote, I still love his book on the divine rest for human restlessness. It strikes tones, as in Heschel's book on the Sabbath, that the Sabbath has meaning to us in the midst of our chaos, in the midst of our weariness, that it becomes, as for Heschel, that sanctuary in time where we encounter God, rather than being something that is about rules. We have this hope that the church can be a place where these things are found. We have this hope that instead of divisive partisanship, the church can be a place of unity through the one Holy Spirit who is poured out upon every believer. We have this hope that it is a place where all gifts are treasured, where differences can be celebrated and can flourish, where we can creatively follow different paths in witnessing in our different neighborhoods to the one hope that we share. So, Lauren, I turn it over to you, and I see a few hands.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just start out by saying I'm very inspired by the sort of redefinition that you're proposing here. I am inspired by the fact that you did your best to reach back into Adventist history to find notes that give us a much more grace appeal. My question, I suppose, Bill, is how did historical Adventism get defined as corporate Adventism? I struggle a little bit where you said that we are a movement, not a corporation. I don't think there's a lot of people who see it that way. I think there's a lot of people who see the church as a corporation that needs to be successful, there's too much at stake for us to define ourselves with grace and inclusion, and that worries me a little bit. Can you respond to that? I guess what I'm saying is I don't hear those at the top of the church who have a lot of influence leaving room for this really hopeful vision that you're giving here.
Well, I did suggest that this is kind of some counterpoint to certain. Yes. I think we see it starting historically when these other movements start breaking off and establishing themselves. So who then becomes the real Adventist? The Advent movement is this very broad thing. And even after 1844, we have the Advent Christian Church started, and we have other different movements using that word Advent and using that word Adventist. Then we come to the 20th century. Well, we start with the organization. We first have the organization in 1863, which is both to coalesce the church and also be able to speak to the government and saying, yeah, you're talking about the draft, and you're saying you're going to give exceptions to historic churches that believed in peace. Well, we're founded, but we want you to see us in that same light as you see the Quakers and the Anabaptists. But that movement towards organization does grow throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. And I think it kind of builds to that point, like in the Mary Kay Silver case, where the lawyers for the church are saying this is a hierarchical institution that no Adventist ever would have said. And then we get to more recent years where the lawyers are saying nobody else can use the word Adventist. We are Adventist. Of course, Kinship had their case where the lawyers tried to say, you can't call yourself Seventh-day Adventist, Kinship. And the court said, yeah, they can. Yeah, you look at the terms on usage. We're not supposed to use the abbreviation SDA. We should use Adventist as the shorthand form, as if we're the only Adventists anymore. Well, what happened to all these other denominations? The Advent Christian Church is tiny. It never got the missionary impulse. But when I go to chaplain endorser meetings, I meet our counterpart from the Advent Christian Church, who's rejoices in our cousinship. And we have a good time talking about the different ways that we've gone. So this is really a call to some organizational humility. And that's
thank you for that. Chris Widmer, join the conversation, would you please?
Yes, good morning. Thanks, Bill, for that great presentation. Good to see you again. And I think it's the third time I've seen your face moving about.
Chris, I'm sorry, I muted you. Sorry about that.
How's that? Is that
much
on?
better? You're fine.
Well, I was just looking
moving about.
I was just looking at Ed's last comment in the chat that the attitude that Bill has and many of us have here comes from rubbing shoulders with people who are not part of the corporation. We don't just have our shoulders rubbed with people who are like us and promoting the same three angels messages that we hear the corporate want to present. And I think that the more we can be outside our little envelope, the more wider our views and the more grace we have towards others. That's just kind of a preliminary comment. I think, Bill, our eschatology leads most of us to short circuit grief, and that's my chaplain comment today. How many funerals have we done that say, almost like a Charles Fitch who died 9 days before the October 22, and he was buried, but he really wasn't mourned because, hey, we're going to see him in 9 days. I think that was Fitch. We often have funerals where our eschatology prevents us from mourning. Oh, don't worry, we're going to see them soon. And the articles that AT has put out, even the one most recently, can't remember who wrote the one recently, Lauren, but what does soon mean? And I contemplate that a lot now in my own life and my own spirituality. How do we keep from being date setters in our modern context? We don't set a date, but we say, we'll see them soon. Don't worry, don't grieve as those who have no hope. Well, then don't grieve at all because we'll see them soon. I think for me, who, I'm the youngest of all my cousins, I sometimes say, and all my aunts and uncles are dead, and my parents and my grandparents. Soon hasn't happened yet. And I don't want to become a scoffer. Where is the promise of his coming? But I question the soonness of Jesus coming. And I find myself saying, I don't know about the timing. I do know who is coming. That's my Lord and Savior. And I do know he's coming eventually. I just don't, I can't say it's soon. I can't say it's before the next general conference or, before I turn 70, which is a few years away yet.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. There is so much unresolved grief that we have bottled up, and so much of it comes forth in our anger, in our frustration. And there's one group that feel that they have lost their idea of the Adventist church, and that results in anger-filled publications that I won't mention by name, but we all can think of some. But in the church, the loss, we think of how many members we lose for every one we gain. Those statistics that whenever David Trim gives them of how many have lost. And that sense of loss that we have, not seeing people that were once part of it, that sense of disconnect. And I see Randy Robertson has made some points. My son-in-law was an aviation major at Andrews, and Randy was one of his favorite professors. But the issue of LGBTQ individuals in the church and their loss of a sense of connection, community. Is there even a church here for me? And that I have that in my family. My wife's one sibling, Jerry, is non-binary. I minister so much with gay and lesbian and transgendered soldiers in the military, in the hospital setting. And too often they just get, no, there's no place for you. We're not going to recognize you. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And I'm just amazed at those who still have this faith to come forward and still identify themselves as Adventists. Floyd Painitz and I were talking about this, and he vents his frustration and his grief, but yet he's not going to let go of it. And Randy also says, if we're talking religious liberty, how are we going to, what about those? And that's one of the areas where we see the fundamentalists saying we've got to take their theology and impose it by law. And we see that especially here in Texas. Where are we as Adventists standing up and saying we believe in separation of church and state, and we don't think any of the commandments, not just the fourth, or those that are uniquely religious, are the business of the state. And yet here we have in Africa, Adventist Conference presidents joining in support of anti-gay legislation that includes death penalties. I mean, where have we gone? So yeah, there's a lot to grieve about. And what's our response to grief? That's the question. What are we going to do with that anger, that loss that we feel? Is it going to turn into action?
Well, Lauren has put me up to bat.
Okay.
And so let me just say thank you to Chris. I think your observations opened up some thoughtful areas for us to consider. And now we come to Ed. Your hand is up, and we're interested in your observations here.
Thank you. Bill, I really appreciated your presentation.
Oh, and can you identify yourself so I know who you are, since we have 5 screens and I'm not actually seeing anybody highlighted and I can't see the name. So when you start speaking, let me know who you are and where you're from.
Yeah, my name is Ed Reifschneider. As I say, I appreciated your presentation very much. I view it as aspirational rather than reality. I like the church you described a lot better than the church that actually exists. And I feel constant tension in my own mind about that the church I would like to see is clearly not the church that exists. And what does one do about that? You referred to some people who have the same questions, but who hang on, I think is the term you used. Why should we? If we like a church that's different than the one that actually exists, and we don't have the power to change the one that actually exists, what is one to do? I'm going to just guess. I don't know this, but I'm just going to guess that I'm speaking for a lot of Adventists right now who wish to see a different. The church you described is a church that is more focused on humanity, on being of service, being compassionate and giving. The church that actually exists, at least officially, is one that's focused almost entirely on doctrine and belief and behavior. Where do we go?
Thanks, Ed. That's a good question. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. The apostles saw so many people leaving for a different reason. But that is our question in a different way. One, I look for hope that, the ordained Adventist pastors can start churches. There's conferences where churches have been started. They're run against that are swimming upstream. I was at Glendale City Church and a few weeks ago, and just amazed that here they in Hollywood are still within that sisterhood of churches. But I don't have any church like that in Houston. I go to some of our regional conference churches, and I find much more hope there, and some of them here in Houston that are very involved in the community. Do we try to work from within and make change and do different things and speak up? What if we're the only one? It gets lonely. It gets more grief. I'm sure there's people here on this call that have found it more hopeful visiting other churches or not going at all and turning on their favorite video, whether it's this Sabbath school class or Advent Hope or some of the other churches around the country. For me, it's using what voice I have and having what pulpit I have, and I get to go around the country and speak to offer a different vision, and to grieve with those who grieve, and to hope that that God's word is still creative and can still call something light out of the darkness. I hope that each of you can be that seed that can speak. When I go to the Adventist Society for Religious Studies meetings, I see reasons for hope in some of our professors. When I go to our academies and colleges, especially some of our colleges, and see hopeful young people who stand up and want to make a difference. Like when the president of the General Conference went to Andrews and students were told, you can only submit questions in writing, and those have to be turned in a week in advance. And so a group of them stood in line behind a microphone that they brought and just stood there in silent protest, saying, we want a voice. We want to be in dialogue. And I'm told by one of the professors that he did stay and talk with individuals for about an hour and a half afterwards. I see my own daughter and her husband who have seen so much hurtful. And my daughter is a scientist. She's in vet school now and studied public health. And to see so many Adventists who attacked her for being a scientist and for promoting public health, and yet she stood up and said, I'm not going to let that define what my Adventism is. And I'm glad they were able to find a church in their community where that view was embraced. But I don't have a short answer. I can point to those points of light. But I also respect those who feel God calling them in different directions. And I have friends who have gone to different places that I still am friends with, that I still support. Some of our chaplains that are now in different places where they feel more supported. And I pray for the Holy Spirit to continue working.
Thank you. It's a question with probably no answer.
Right.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask it anyway.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I think we have to get past, is the need to think that we can have all the answers. Now, I did an evangelistic series. I had to do one when pastoring the Texas conference, but I did it based on the series Lost, which was popular at the time in its final season. And the theme was God is still searching. And at the end of each talk, I had a period of open dialogue. And the senior pastor I was working with at the time, who was known for being very innovative in evangelism, he just turned pale and he says, I can't imagine opening up a evangelistic series to Q&A. I'd be too scared for what might be said. But I thought it was fun.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you for sure. And before I come to my good friend, Jerry Lofthouse, Bill, I'd like to ask you a question myself. I had a birthday yesterday, and it gave me an opportunity to sort of reflect on old times. And when I was a young child, it was the fashion sometimes for mothers to give their daughters permanents. And your hair would be wrapped up in little rollers, and this waving solution would be put on. And when the time was done, there would be a neutralizer put on it to stop the action and calm everything down. And I say that because I'm so much impressed with your talk, principally because you seem to be neutralized. I haven't attended this group probably as long as some, but I think many of us have questions and doubts and worries about our institutional church. And you seem to have such a vivacity. You don't seem to cower in the shadow of church employment, because you've been very open and straightforward with us, which I think everyone here appreciates. And I just have a brief question. I wonder, is it easier, do you suppose, for you to have hope because you spent the years that you did outside the structural Adventist church? Is that what neutralized you in a way where you don't seem to reflect some of the agitation, maybe is the term I should use, that I suspect some of us feel?
Well, I think, it's partly that, and seeing that, there are Christians in other places. I was grateful that at AUC, we had professors that took us out into the world. We went to conversations at BU with theologians like Wolfhart Pannenberg, Langdon Gilkey, philosopher Charles Hartshorne, Francis Schaeffer, so a wide spectrum of folks. And I remember at a talk at the Evangelistic Association of New England, that was related to Billy Graham's organization. Francis Schaeffer was up there in his knickers and his long hair. And I'm looking around and I'm seeing these people of all different faiths and during the worship. And in my heart, I'm thinking, here's a glimpse of heaven. And the theology major next to me said, it's a pity these fools don't know the truth. And I was just shocked. And that's what led me to go visit a non-Adventist church for the first time the next day. So yeah, those times outside and building real relationships with people of other faiths has been rewarding for me and given me different perspectives. I don't put it often on my Adventist resume, but I have a Doctor of Ministry degree in the field of ecumenism. One of those bad words that we're not supposed to say. But yet my ministry as a chaplain is just that. And it's being able to work as a part of the team with, when I was deployed, here I was, an Adventist as the brigade chaplain. My senior chaplain was Presbyterian. I supervised chaplains who were gay and straight, Catholic, Assembly of God, Old Catholic, Nazarene. I had lay leaders that I supervised who were Muslim and Mormon and Jewish and Wiccan. And we all work together as a team to provide for the religious and spiritual needs of everybody in our unit. And I live in Houston, so I don't live in Maryland. And I still have a ministry here in my community with my soldiers, with my veterans community. I'm on the state suicide prevention advisory board. And so those are the things that continue to enrich me, is having that life in the world, in the community. The other day, I got a call from one of my former soldiers who I knew in 2009, asking me if I could do a wedding in a couple of months for him. And then he called back and said, there's some circumstances that are happening. Could you do it tomorrow night? And I said, yes. We had very brief pastoral counseling beforehand, and I will continue our relationship. But I rejoice in being able to do those things and being called upon. We planned a symposium with the county mental health agency and other veteran service organizations on the topic of moral injury. And so in these things, I'm working side by side with people of so many different faiths, and ones who respect who I am as an Adventist. That's the interesting thing in the world of healthcare. In the world of military chaplaincy, people look up to us as a leader in being able to get along with other people and being able to minister while maintaining our own identity with people of all different faiths. So they see a very different side of Adventism than we do inside. And so those are some of the things that do encourage me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, it might interest you to know that all those many years ago, I was born at Brooks Hospital at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio.
I was just there the other day. We have one of our great women chaplains who is finishing up her clinical pastoral education there and is a real trailblazer.
Excellent. Well, I know we appreciate so much the freshness of your presentation. And let me come now to my very dear friend, Jerry Lofthouse. Jerry and I had the distinct privilege of being invited to sit on sort of an unusual situation. I don't know if it exists at other places, but Jerry and I were invited by our pastor, Dan Smith, to be on what he called his sermon group. And we met on Wednesday mornings at an ungodly hour to give him thoughts and ideas about his sermon. Jerry was the chief terrorizer, and I would have been next in line on that. So, but it was a fascinating experience. And Jerry, welcome to you today. I'm glad to see you. And
likewise,
please give Bill your thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll just add that thanks to Linda, Dan has never been the same. His message today would not be there without our contribution. So I'm very proud of that.
Only because I threatened to call up Hilda and ask her if what he said was really true.
Like you said, Chief. Bill, I want to pick up on something you just told us a little vignette about, and that is, will you marry us? Oh, could you do that tomorrow? Is this church a sacramental religion, or is it not? I maintain that the only sacraments I hear in my church are those which we will deny because of who you are. I do not see us offering a sacrament that is in any way a contribution to someone's life, except that we can withhold it if we need to. Ellen White talks about Christ's method being the only method that we can minister to humanity. We find what their needs are, we meet those needs, we call them our friend, we let them know we care about them, and then we say, come follow me. Those sacraments, the gifts of service, I find lacking in our institution. Is it possible for us as individuals to re-sacramentalize our religion? What do you think?
Wow. A lot of things you packed in there. And what is a sacrament? Augustine defined it as a verbum visibilium. These are the things I get to learn at a Lutheran seminary, a few Latin phrases, a visible word. And that's how Luther picked that up to talk about the sacraments as being visible words, that word taking on shape in an action, in something that we do. And if you look at those that, we don't often use the word sacrament. Ellen White does use it a few times in talking about the Lord's Supper. But what were those sacraments intended to do? Jesus washed the feet and broke the bread and shared the cup with Judas. His meals were meals of inclusion. The washing that he called his disciples to do was one for the forgiveness of sins, to wash, to purify. These were the opposite of gatekeeping functions that they became in the church. I think of the first time that I gave communion to somebody who I knew was both gay and HIV positive, and I, as a chaplain, was supposed to go with the doctor to inform him of his test that he'd done, and he came forward to communion, and being able to touch him and embrace him and give that bread to him was one of the most powerful experiences in my ministry. Those things that we do in the community for its good, I think, can have that be those sacraments, those signs of grace, those signs of the presence of God. Now, we've never had an Adventist theologian write a book on sacraments, which is funny given the Lutheran tradition. There's so many. I have a bookshelf. I could have shelves and shelves and shelves of them, but we've never even had somebody write a single book about the Lord's Supper. We just kind of assumed it's one of those things that we do, and we better fold the napkin in the right way afterwards over the elements. We have the restrictions in the church manual of this is the way. But there's so much enriching the Sabbath as a sacrament. That's one of the great things that Heschel talks about. And I love that imagery. Again, the Sabbath is a place where the divine becomes manifest and visible and experienced. And what if we did that in community? What if our hospitals were signs of that grace and not, as Randy said in the comments, places where we're going to be just go along and enforce whatever the law of the land is? What if there were places of welcoming? And parenthetically, I'm going to say hi to my friend Steve Mitchell. We were in grad school together at Loma Linda long ago, and he just greeted me privately. So those are my reactions, my reflections on that point.
Well, we come now to Johnny. Welcome to you. I'm glad to see you here today. I've seen your name before. Pose your question or observation, if you would, to Pastor Cork.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely presentation, and greetings from the United Kingdom. We are busy here sending refugees back from to France Channel and so on, and fighting very difficult ethical questions. Our government is not very gentle with some people. I wanted to ask you, from the point of view of your military experience, from the point of view of your work in the military, as far as I understand that you have been military chaplain for a number of years ago, when you go around our churches and talk to our young people, what is your opinion of, surely there must be a number of young people who say, Pastor Cork, I'd like to go into military. I can get school fees paid. I can get this. I can get that. So it's brilliant. And simply, what is your opinion of our young people wanting to go into military? And what do you advise from the point of view of simply Adventist, traditional, non-resistant, and keep away from trying to hurt others?
Thanks, Johnny. Where are you from originally?
I am from Belgrade, Serbia, but we live in Newbold College here, yeah.
Newbold. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's the question I get when I go to Europe. Especially my friends Stefan Ziech and Barna Magdarashi. We've had some long discussions on these points because that's an area where it seems like we're slipping as Adventists, where we've been more informed by the world, especially in the U.S. I've had Adventist pastors with MDiv degrees from the seminary tell me that they're never knew that the Adventists had a position on non-combatancy. And it's like, I scratch my head. We had, of course, in Europe, we had the situation where starting in World War I, Ludwig Conradi, who had been an evangelist in America, he goes back and says, forget all that stuff. Go pick up arms, forget the Sabbath, and fight for the fatherland. And
that's why reform movement was established.
Right. And we didn't even talk to them until a few years ago, the 100th anniversary of that split. And I've been to a concentration camp in Germany where it was mainly Bibelstudenten, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Adventists who were there. And we said nothing about them. Nothing was done to the German church leaders by the GC after World War I and World War II. And in America, the counterpart was Carlisle B. Haynes, who, when the Bureau of Investigation threatened to ordered his books to be censored on Revelation 13, and he went along with it and came back and tried to show how patriotic Americans are. And he was the one who picked up on the conscientious cooperator phrase that was in a Fort Worth newspaper and said, yeah, we're not trying to change the world. We're not trying to speak to the government. We're just talking about our individual decision, and God bless America. And I found some awful things that he said in the 1950s in support of segregation, and saying anybody who believes in the brotherhood of God and the fatherhood of man is a communist. And he just tapped into the darkest side in supporting segregation in the 1950s. And we have those other dark spots, Rwanda, where Adventist leaders got convicted of war crimes for herding Adventists of a different tribe into a church where they could be slaughtered. I hear those things and I see those things. And the church, officially, we still have an official position of non-combatancy. And we had a conference at the General Conference a couple of years ago, bringing together all the chaplaincy and youth and young adult leaders of the divisions to reaffirm that. The church statement says we advocate a non-combatant position. And then there's a conscience clause that we will allow individual conscience. And some people thought that was a great apostasy, but we had that phrase in the 1930s in our official statement then. But it's 1973, that was our last official statement. And the reason why we put that conscience clause in there was because Adventist young people, influenced by the anti-war movement, said we do not want to be 1AO, conscientious cooperators, non-combatants who are serving in uniform. We want to be 1O, objectors who are going to do non-military service. And the Army said, well, your church says you have to have a 1AO position. So they put that thing in there to say, no, Adventists can be conscientious objectors or pacifists and still be in the good graces of the church. But I think we've used that to go the other way and just say, oh, it doesn't matter. Go Green Beret, go Navy SEAL, go out into embrace the dark side, as we put it in the Army. And what are we saying? So what do I do? Well, I want to tell them what the reality of it is. And it's what Dick Stenbakken told us back in the 70s, that, if you volunteer, you're not going to be a non-combatant. Only the chaplain is a non-combatant in the U.S. military. Only the chaplain does not carry weapons. But otherwise, you're going to be trained for it. And I had one youth, I was at GYC, I had a booth where I could talk about non-combatant issues and about mental health issues. And one parent that I knew, whose kids grew up with mine, said, hey, my son's joining the National Guard. Can you talk to him? And he ended up, we ended up not having a conversation before he left. Next thing I know, he was being administratively separated, because he gets out on the bayonet course and they're going, blood makes the grass grow, kill, kill, kill. And he's suddenly shocked that, oh, being in the military is about killing. Now, we've been at war in the US for 20 years. And I don't think anybody can join the military and not realize that it's about killing. And we've seen this whole topic of moral injury growing, this feeling of guilt and shame for having crossed a moral line. And that term was first coined by a VA psychiatrist, Jonathan Shea, in his book, Achilles in Vietnam, where he saw that American vets were following the path of Achilles in the Iliad, betrayed by their leaders and acting out in anger and hate and depression. I remember seeing a meme around the time of the surge in Iraq saying, I joined the military thinking that I was a Jedi and came to realize I'm a stormtrooper. And working in the VA part-time as I do, the number of soldiers who are just so disillusioned by the withdrawal from Afghanistan and leaving so many of their partners, Afghan nationals, behind. Again, a feeling of betrayal. There's Iraq Vets Against the War, Veterans for Peace, a lot of organizations like that that directly reach out to those military members who are feeling, yeah, we were lied to by the weapons of mass destruction. So, I talk about moral injury. I talk about how war damages the soul just by your being part of it. I talk about the fact that 1 woman in 4 is going to be sexually assaulted in the military, often by somebody in their chain of command, and often the military is not going to do a thing about it. And those numbers are going up. Or just this week, about, I think it's like a 19% increase in sexual assaults at the academies. And the suicide rate. I had 6 suicides in 1 week in my National Guard brigade. I have done more suicide interventions there, and done more. I never did a combat death notification for somebody who died in combat. I've done death notifications for soldiers who died by suicide or were murdered or died in accidents. So I said, you want to join the military? Well, let's look at the church's position, where it came from, why we have it. Let's talk about what the reality is that I've seen after 20 years of ministry. Well, more than that, because I had ministry with veterans. So since 1986, the ministry I've had with veterans. And the American Friends Service Committee has a great little checklist, 10 things you should consider before joining the military. And that is, talk to real veterans and see what their experience is like. Make sure that you bring along a veteran with you when you go to sign the contract. Make sure you do not sign the contract immediately, but you take it home and you think about it and you reflect on it and you do your research. And look at what the military's been doing for 20 years. And if in that case that you're still thinking, hey, this is it, well, what kind of service are you looking at? There's different forms of service. There are different things where you're going to be either more directly or less directly involved. If you want to go in, why? What difference do you think you can make? And then that fallback of the conscience is, I think conscience has to be an informed conscience. And that's why we are also there for those who choose to go in. That's why we are there to support them, and we're going to go wherever they go. We have 130 military chaplains currently in the United States, all components, all branches, Army, Air Force, Reserve, or Army, Air Force, Navy, Guard, Reserve, active duty. We have chaplains in about a dozen countries around the world. Australia recently got them. We've had a couple in Canada. We have, I think Ghana is the largest country in Africa that with the most number. Nigeria, I believe Kenya, maybe Tanzania. So there are more places looking for it, but that's the presentation that I give. And as I said, once I did that at one church, and the pastor came up and says, "How can you say that my grandfather was wrong for going into the military and fighting Hitler? How can you say the Adventists have this position?" Well, I could say that because it's been our position since the very beginning.
Johnny, I thank you for your question. I think few people besides Pastor Cork could have given as comprehensive a response. And so we appreciate that today. Thank you very much. Randy Robertson, we're glad that you're here today. Glad to see you. What are your questions or observations for Bill?
Hey, Bill. I really did enjoy your presentation and your statement, your immediate exploration of military service is insightful. As you know, I spent 22 years in the Air Force as a pilot and obviously a combatant, although I never saw actual combat. Certainly was in combat zones. And oddly, and people can say whatever they want, you were so on point about the moral challenge. At this point, probably I lean deeply toward being a complete objector, other than such as maybe the chaplaincy and not even medical service, because the job of doctors and nurses and all of the medical service people is to send people back. So, and that's been a big shift for me over the last few years, but that's not where I was going with my thoughts and questions, but profound insight, and keep saying what you're saying, because I think it is so incredibly on point. Switching gears to the domestic front, so to speak. As I look at what is going on within our nation and the hostile political environment or the contentious political environment that exists, the silence of the church, the Adventist church, and the church broadly beyond Adventism is deafening. And it's appalling. It's the silence of assent or the lack of active dissent that allows the evil of society to grow and prosper and flourish. And I look at just this year alone in this 2023 legislative season at the state level, and there are well over 300 bills that specifically target transgender people. And then there's more when you add more broadly the LGBTQ community beyond. And there's no protest. You don't even have to have doctrine that is supportive of LGBTQ people. How do we get the church? How do we get church leadership? Where do we go? Where do we turn to say, you have a moral voice that you need to speak up, and it's going to hurt. Yeah, it's going to hurt your corporate position in all the hospitals in the states where this is an issue. Yeah, but when does that an excuse? I don't know. I struggle deeply with it right now.
Thanks, Randy. And it's good to finally meet you and do something other than chat and private messages and to hear your voice. And I look forward to being able to sit down with you sometime, because I do appreciate you, and thank you.
Sure, we can do that.
I was thinking of when I was at AUC, and I had Audley Stafford as one of my English professors and as director of plays, and I was in Man for All Seasons, and Thomas More talks about the legal phrase as silencio qui tacit consentire, silence gives tacit consent, and they were trying to twist him into saying something else. Is no, if I'm silent, you must construe that I consented, not that I denied. So yeah, by not saying anything, by not standing up, we are consenting to whatever happens. Oh, it doesn't concern us. I was in Auschwitz, or no, Dachau, a couple of years ago, and I stood in Martin Niemöller's cell. His famous saying, first they came for the communists, then the socialists, and then all these other people, and then they finally came for me. And he had such guilt and shame, and was seen as a collaborator. We lift him up as if he was a hero, and he only spoke up when he was troubled, when it affected him directly. And he was an example of what not to do, of somebody who stayed silent when the moral test was before him. I think one of the places that has to start is by actually pastors being unafraid to listen to the hurt of their church members. And I am disappointed and grieved when I hear of church leaders who will not even sit down and talk to people who are hurting over these issues. Because I know what difference it has made for me in my life, to take something from being an abstraction to the reality of friends, of family members. Just at the time that the military was debating transgender issues, I was teaching a suicide prevention class at Fort Meade in Maryland, which is the home of the NSA, and there were a number of people with those TS clearances that were part of that. Two of whom were transgendered. One of whom was the active leader in the movement within the military to get recognition, because she was an E8 within that sanctuary zone before retirement, and she had nothing to lose. And she spoke up so eloquently. When I did clinical pastoral education at Walter Reed 36 years ago, I was the youngest person, a 24-year-old second lieutenant. Everybody else was senior captains. The senior guy in the class was a major who got promoted to Lieutenant Colonel Paul Dodd, and he and I shared an office together. And after he retired from the military as the commander, the command chaplain for the U.S. Medical Command, he came out. And he formed an organization called the Forum for the Military Chaplaincy to look at how can chaplains be more supportive of the diversity of the military members. And he was one of the key individuals working for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I was in Austin last week, and I took him out to dinner. We've been friends for 36 years, and I've appreciated that friendship. So these are the things that have opened me and led me to say, even if we're not going to change our position on sexuality, we have this position on human rights. We have this position on separation of church and state. The situation in Uganda is just so critically, people are dying, and we need to say something when church leaders support that. We need to speak up for people who are not just strangers, but are our family and friends. And in my sermons, I do. And because I do, I have people coming up and saying, I'm grateful that you can talk about this. When I talk about suicide, you're the first pastor who's ever talked about suicide in our church, or mental health issues. I have a son with mental health issues, and I talk about them, and that gives freedom and permission for the church to talk about it, and the church to say, can we be a place of welcome? Can we be a place that feels the pain of those who are hurting? So thanks, Randy.
Thank you, Pastor. Ann Hall, it's time for you. We're interested in your comments or questions for Bill today.
Bill, this comes from a context of great appreciation and respect for you and great love for this group. I left the Adventist Church by inactivity, but also deliberately, because I could not stand its stance that it was the only group, the select group that God had chosen. And I work in a university chapel that's interdenominational and has an interfaith ministry. So my question for you, and I apologize for putting you on, for asking such a pointed question, but given that you went from the Adventist church into the Lutheran church, and I grant that I don't know what the Lutheran view of the baptismal sacrament is, I just wondered when you came back to the Adventist church, and why you felt the need to be rebaptized, or why you were kind of forced into a position of rebaptism, since, as far as I can tell, even in your more questioning moments, you love Christ.
Well, thanks, Ann, for the question. And hey, being a military chaplain for 20 years, I'm not afraid of any question. So don't be afraid of putting me on the spot. And that's a good question. Yeah, theologically, I say there's one baptism. What is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. That's what Scripture says. And I think Adventists do too much rebaptism. And guess what? That's what the church manual says too. That we shouldn't be rebaptizing people willy-nilly every time they get a new emotional experience. Like too many academy chaplains, dare I say, or evangelists do. Oh, if you don't have any baptism, well, do we have anybody rebaptism? I knew one church member who'd been rebaptized like 9 times every time a new evangelist came to town, or people by the time they were 20 that had been rebaptized half a dozen times. But this was one of the hurdles that was put before me. And in my theology, I saw it as, in my theological understanding, I saw it as a reaffirmation of baptism. In the same way that washing of the feet is. So that's how I rationalized it. As for me, I was reaffirming baptism. There were people who didn't think I should be reordained. There were people in the General Conference who saw that there was no theological reason to reordain me. But the Texas Conference president at the time, Leighton Holly, said, look at it as our way to affirm your ministry by laying hands and praying. And I said, well, I'm not going to object to people praying for me. But that's how I dealt with it. And because, theologically, I would say any rebaptism is just an affirmation of baptism. You don't see it in the New Testament.
I want to thank Ann for her question. I think it's sort of a subliminal issue that we all recognize and perhaps don't speak about very much. And I particularly appreciate Bill's response to it. I have a relative who's been rebaptized at least twice, I think. So, and it's the emotional thing that you describe. And so it does really raise the question. So thank you for that, Ann, and to Bill. Lauren, you're up.
Oh, yeah, thanks again. A little while, I have 2 things I want to say. A little while back, people were saying, how do we get people's attention about this more open and progressive view? And I just want to say, I want to come to the defense of some of us who are trying to do that, Bill, and that is organizations like the One Project certainly did that. Spectrum does that, and I'm proud that Adventist Today does it too. And now I am especially proud to know, Bill, that you think like we do in terms of trying to open the gates of grace a little more widely. My wife was a chaplain for the last 20 years of her ministry. doing both hospital chaplaincy and hospice chaplaincy. And I always have to say I envied her. I envied her ability to speak to all people everywhere rather than having just a restricted congregation who I had to try to please all the time. And so that was very nice. But what I really want to come back to, Bill, is this matter of pacifism or pacificism or non-combatancy, however you want to do it. You know, Bill, when I was young, I grew up in the 60s and 70s as a teenager, that era. And when I was young, it was so clear, Bill, it was so absolutely clear that we were not to kill people. We would find almost anything to do, including some of my friends who went into a program called the White Coats and took experimental medicines and things like that. But there was never any doubt in my mind. I can still remember walking into the Selective Service office in Jamestown, North Dakota, and saying very clearly, without any question, the classification that I wanted. And why are you doing that? Because I'm a Seventh Adventist, and here's a letter from my pastor. And then as I went through my ministry, this was Chris Widmer noted this in a note here that it was exactly what I have been told too. And that is, once it became a volunteer army, there was no reason to ever teach anybody, apparently, about the church's stand on pacifism or pacificism, or whatever that word is. I have a hard time with it. And to now, Bill, it is just gone. When I spoke of it from the pulpit, people would scratch their heads. They had no idea that Adventist church ever held those views. It was like a brand new thing. A few years ago, I had a conversation with somebody from the chaplain's office, and I'm thinking it might have been Gary Council, because Gary had a certain view of this that troubled me a little bit. And I'm pretty sure it must have to have been Gary, because he made that note again about now we have a volunteer army. And he said, we have, at that time, not one person who has contacted our office to ask us to be a non-combatant and to have that status. Not one Seventh-day Adventist. Now, there may have been somebody just before that or just after that, but that was at that particular time. And he went so far as to say, I don't know why, how in any way I can ask people who want to serve their country by killing enemies who want to kill us, not to do that. I guess I see where he was coming from, but it just so surprised me. It was such a 180 from how I was raised, Bill. Mm-hmm. It was so completely new to me that nobody was still teaching these things. Help me out here.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And let me say, yes, I do appreciate Adventist Today and Spectrum, and have been writing for both publications, especially on the web versions, for the past many years. And I'm grateful that they have given me that platform and invited me to do so. And man, I even had Bonnie paid me for one article that she specifically asked me to write. That was a first.
Yes. She never paid me. What makes her so special?
She needed a particular article on a particular topic in a very short time. So yeah. You zero in on a particular point, and I think the key moment in history was the end of the draft. And suddenly we no longer had these numbers of Adventists being brought before draft boards in the U.S. And I've talked to all the people that we've had in ACM since those days, and that everybody agrees that's where it just dropped off. We stopped having the Medical Cadet Corps, which was in the academy. It started at Union College, and then went on to other academies and colleges to teach Adventist young men how to be military medics, so that when they went before the draft board and asked to be 1AO, they could say, and here I have been trained to meet these standards. And then the end of the draft ended Operation Whitecoat. And part of my job is I'm the office liaison to Fort Detrick and USAMRIID and the veterans who participated in Operation Whitecoat. And I really love those guys. Some of them say, well, I just did it to get out of going to Vietnam. Another guy said, well, actually, to tell the truth, of all the Adventists in my group, I was the only one who didn't smoke and drink. So we can scrape off the silver lining of hagiography. But at the same time, they didn't want to kill, but they wanted to make a difference. And here in that project, they were being given different pathogens that could be used in biological war and being human subjects of experimentation in regards to testing of therapies and vaccines for it. And and I have great relationship with the folks there. And whenever anyone who participated in it wants their medical records, I've got the form that I can give them, and they get their full medical records from USAMRIID within a couple of days. And USAMRIID did a follow-up of them, parenthetically, about 10 years ago. They did a health survey of everybody who participated, and they got about 25 to 30% response, which for any survey is really good. And then they looked up each individual's medical record to see, did they get a placebo? Did they get a pathogen? Did they get a vaccine? How many trials were they part of? To then see if they could draw any correlations between health issues that they suffered and what they received. And on the basis of that, the only long-term health consequences is that some who got tularemia vaccine, I believe it was, were more likely to have headaches and asthma. But Phil Pittman, who's the current director of research and has been for many years, he's getting the funding to do another study that he wants to do before he retires in the next couple of years, to actually do more intensive looking at the health records of those still living, do tests on them, and to see if they can go deeper and see if there were any other long-term. They really want to know that, and they really want to support the veterans, and I'm grateful for that. So when I met Dick Stenbakken, and he came to Broadview Academy in 1977 when I was a junior, so I'm a little bit younger than you. I didn't hit 18. The draft was gone for several years by the time I got there. But he and other chaplains were giving presentations in all of our academies on what do we do now that there's a volunteer army. And in that context, he mentioned chaplains, and I raised my hand and said, so what does it take to be an Army chaplain? And he said, first you have to be a pastor, then we have to pick you. Next question. Everybody laughed. But 10 years later, I was an Army chaplain candidate. We have not done a good job of teaching it. I think there are some particular individuals, I think Gary's one of them, that did present a particular position that was one-sided. And I've asked the question, what can we do better to teach our young people and to recover this? And let me give you this. Here's an article that I had in Spectrum that I actually wrote for Andrews University Center for Youth Evangelism has the 180-degree symposium on youth ministry every year, and brings in people to talk about issues related to youth. That year it was on social justice issues, Gen Z and social issues. So I did this one on teaching peace during multi-generation war. You know, at the beginning of the Iraq War, there was actually a great statement from the General Conference called a call to peace that was saying we need to stand up, we need to speak, we need to recover. We should have pastors preach on a yearly basis about the Adventist teaching on nonviolence, that schools should have an annual week of devotion to teaching of the principles of nonviolence. At the end of the Cold War, Neil Wilson went to a symposium in Moscow. He had Mikhail Gorbachev sitting in front of him, and it was, you know, how do we secure a peaceful and just world after the fall, after the end of the Cold War? And there, Neil Wilson said that social justice is intrinsic to peace. So we've had that, but after that statement in 2005, nothing was done. There's a few articles that you can find in the Journal of Adventist Education about how to teach peace, but it's some more than not, people just are not aware of it. No. So that article talks more about the history and the documentation, as well as some resources and approaches, because I think we need to recover it. And one of the things I did was I started visiting some of these other faith groups. I went to the Shakers. There's one last Shaker village in Sabbath Day Lake in Maine, and I went to worship with them one Sunday. And they have a lot of people from the community who come, who see that as their church. And I spent a day in their archives looking at their documentation from World War I, World War II, how they were dealing with it. The Quakers, I've been making contacts in the Quaker world and visited the Houston Friends meeting, reached out to a number of people in the Anabaptist community, and have worshiped quite a number of times with the Houston Mennonite Church, really trying to immerse myself in what are these ways that we can do more to treat our children. Or teach our children, of peace. You know, for other parts of the world, it's like, why are you Americans so far behind? Germany learned its lessons after World War II, and the German Adventists thoroughly embrace a pacifist understanding, and just think that we've been so corrupted by the American culture. That we're being taught by it, and I see that there's been so much work that's been done about what happened during World War I. That was really the crisis that got Adventists to start being more visibly patriotic, when the Bureau of Education or the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor for the FBI, was actually going to churches. They put all the Jehovah's Witnesses leaders in prison, and they came. And if you read the 1919 Bible Conference, there's one thing that we don't pay attention to, where the manager of the review tells how he was approached by the Bureau of Investigation, and they wanted to see all of our publications. They warned the Adventist leaders that they would end up in prison, like the Jehovah's Witness leaders, if they didn't cooperate. And books by Carlisle Haynes and A.G. Daniels were censored. The whole thing on Revelation 13. Instead of this being this beast that is very actually now this contradictory thing, wait sometime in the future when it passes the death decree, only then will the United States be this beast, which in the 1850s, they were saying the U.S. is identified as this beast because it embraces slavery while talking freedom. Originally, not even Sunday laws were part of the identification of it. But that was the point where the church leadership got scared. And the manager of the review says at the 1919 Bible Conference, I really thought people would be upset when they saw that we edited Bible Readings for the Home, our most popular book, but nobody ever said anything. Nobody ever noticed. breath of he kind of brushed the sweat from his brow.
By the way, with reference to that story you just told about Bureau of Investigation, we are having just a little advertisement here. We are having Kevin Burton from Southern Adventist University here later in the summer to tell that story. He's written extensively about that. I don't know if you know that.
Oh yeah. He is the main historian leading that charge, and Jeff Rosario is another. Those two have done so much work.
Yeah.
I was gonna get to his name. I was having a little brain freeze for a moment.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to take up all the time here, so I want to just interrupt and say thank you, because Bill, as a pastor, I can just tell you, even the young people that I know who went to Adventist schools and Adventist academies knew nothing about our stance on pacifism. Nothing.
Yeah,
it's gone.
Yeah, in the notes, Dr. Johnston reminds us that Kevin is no longer at Southern, but he has been for the past year and a half, 2 years, the director for the Center of Adventist Research at Andrews University. So
Okay.
thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Lauren. Ed, welcome to you. Tell us where you're coming from today as you give us your thoughts.
British Columbia, Canada, Vancouver Island. I appreciate that you're focusing a lot on pacifism and, against violence, I guess, or killing, or whatever you want to call it. The United States has become a worldwide killing machine politically. I mean, it's since World War II, apparently it's been involved in about 50 different wars, and it seems like they have, quote, lost all of those wars, and their efforts in Ukraine, $136 billion of support in all kinds of ways, plus all kinds of other countries involved there. And, the more ammunitions and killing and everything, and the war's not going anywhere. I mean, it's almost like a standstill there, or whatever, depends on whose side of the propaganda you're on. But so the consequences of these wars are PTSD, people who die, humongous costs, trillions of dollars to the United States, as well as allies like Canada. We support a lot of what the Americans do, and other countries, and people coming back injured and needing rehabilitation, and families ruptures. The costs of wars, actually, who wins? Nobody wins. And so that's why it's very important, I think, as what you're doing, is to stand up against that. However, my question really is, what kind of backlash in the United States is there for Adventists, for example, who are just out against war, or like the Ukraine war? I mean, it is so politically correct to support what's happening in Ukraine, which includes sending all kinds of aid, not just ADRA helping, but aids of destruction, let's call them that. So that's a question. What kind of backlash have you seen for people who are, or Adventists who are against war? Using the Ukraine war as an example.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in this one, because I don't see too many Adventist voices speaking up against war, and I don't see what anti-war protests have we even had in the nation during this round of war. We had some back in 2003, but after that, not much. I mean, the whole American society is, it seems like, going on without reflecting, without opposing. We were at war for 20 years. And when was it ever debated in any of our presidential elections? Both parties bent over backwards to wave the flag, I think. Parenthetically, let me mention, Robert Johnson the younger is the one who made that comment about where Kevin Burton is, not his father, if his father was confused. So, Robert, thank you. Let me also address a related question that, hey, we have God doing so much killing in the Old Testament. Why should protecting his people? So why would the church adopt a non-combatant position? It's because of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says plenty of times, you heard it said by Moses, but I say to you, Jesus specifically rejected plenty of the inherited teachings from Moses on killing, on divorce, on so many other justifications. And he said, do not resist evil. That's where the phrase non-resistance come from. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy. All of these things are rooted in Jesus' ethic, which he says plainly, I'm telling you something different. But often what I hear whenever I talk about Jesus' teaching, the response is, what about the Old Testament? Why do we go back to the Old Testament to correct Jesus? Our hermeneutic, if it's Christian, starts with the teaching of Jesus and interprets everything in the Bible in the light of him. He is the fullness of God's revelation. He is the one in whom the fullness of Godhead dwells bodily. In many and various ways, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets, but now in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. So we're only having a Christian theology if Jesus is the focal point and if everything is interpreted in light of Jesus Christ. And that has to be our morality as well. And I think as Adventists, that's been our temptation. We want to bring in so much of law, and where's the focus on Jesus, not just as Savior, but as the Lord of life, as the one whose disciples we are, whose ethic, it's going to be different. I'm asked, well, what if everybody took this position? What would happen when bad things happen in the world? Well, Jesus doesn't even address the whole world. He never tells Rome anything. He never tells the Roman soldiers to quit their jobs, but he does address his disciples and has special teaching for them as living the kingdom world, living for him, living his values, and being that light, being that salt. And that is how we're different. And should we be speaking up? I think so. For a long time, even the Mennonites and the Quakers had this more quietistic perspective where we're just going to, this is good for us, but we're not going to tell the world how to do it. World War I, the Mennonites, the Hutterites, and others had been given land in the upper Midwest, in Montana, North Dakota, and so on, and told, yes, you fled Russia because they wanted to force you in the army. You can live peacefully forever, and we will never, ever, ever make you join the military. Well, World War I, there were Mennonites and Hutterites who died in Leavenworth and in Alcatraz because of their nonviolent beliefs. And that's where you have this huge migration from the US to Canada, to the Prairie Provinces. And I was up there a couple of years ago. I was teaching in Winnipeg for the Manitoba Saskatchewan conference, and when I visited a number of the Mennonite museums and heritage centers there, and we were having it at a nursing home where or care center, where I heard an interesting accent from the director, and I asked him where he was from. He says, "Oh, I'm from here." I said, "Well, but where?" He said, "Oh, from a farming community." I said, "But it sounds like a German accent you have." He says, "Oh, I was raised in the Hutterite community." And, there have been a number of people from the Anabaptist traditions that have become Adventist. Look at names like Graybill. I asked Ron about that, and his family were Mennonites who came to Juniata County, Pennsylvania in the 1700s. That's the community where I first started pastoring, where there were Graybills galore. the Voth family. He was at Monterey Bay Academy. That's a Mennonite name, and that whole community became Adventist. There's Tom Taves at Union College. His family was Mennonite who had become Adventist. Unruh, T. Unruh, Pennsylvania Conference president during the Questions on Doctrine discussions. That's a Mennonite name. But it's interesting that they haven't, people from that background haven't been at the forefront of saying, hey, here's something that we can talk about. Here's something that we would like to share from our community's heritage. That's just an interesting thing. But anyways, you can see I can get pretty passionate when I'm talking about this issue, because I think it is one that as somebody who is has a combat patch, somebody who was on an OEF deployment, someone who gets to pick up the pieces of injured soldiers who are dealing with PTSD and moral injury. All the flag waving in the world doesn't take away the fact that I've ministered to soldiers who've had arms and legs blown off in the name of wars that were founded on lies. And we need to speak up on it and not be ashamed, not be shy.
Let me just interrupt here. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Bill, I am one of those North Dakota Russlanddeutsche who who were Germans who went to Russia. One of my grandparents, great-grandparents' families were Mennonites too. Their name was Thiessen. And we used to, there was a joker in our little community in Gackle, North Dakota, who used to say, when they tried to draft us in Germany, we went to Russia. When they tried to draft us in Russia, we came to America. When they tried to draft us in America, we became Seventh Adventists. And it was kind of a humorous way of their expressing their distaste for fighting wars. And I grew up in that setting. Before we go on to Cherry Ann, who's going to have the last comment, I've asked Ed Reifsnyder to have a short benediction for us. Ed, would you go ahead and do that?
Sure. Our Father in heaven, we have discussed many things today. Some things where we're dissatisfied with our spiritual fellowship, some things where there's opportunities for our spiritual fellowship, some things where we scratch our head about our spiritual fellowship, and some good things. And I pray that as we move into the future, that you will guide us. Help us to understand what kind of people, what kind of fellowship we should be as we approach the future, and to move in that direction. So we ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
So Sherry Ann, we're glad you're here, and you get the last word today. What's on your mind for Bill?
All right, thanks, Linda. Thanks, Bill. And Linda, you've done a lovely job for your first time hosting today. So just wanted to say that. But Bill, I wanted to come back to this message of hope. And I'd like you to share for persons who like the aspirational view of the church that you've described, but maybe getting weary with the pushback and the rhetoric from church leaders, and who find hope and a space in the community with Adventist Today and with Spectrum, and are oftentimes seen as troublemakers when we write. What hope do you offer, having left the church and come back into this community? What hope do you offer to persons like that where the church is concerned?
Good question.
Yeah. How can we develop an attitude that is not constantly shaming and criticizing and blaming and pointing fingers and raising non-scriptural barriers and all this stuff that we do that hurts people? How can we give evidence of people that are welcomed when they come back after wandering? Can our stories be told? Where do we find fellowship with those who have been hurt and are finding healing or looking for healing? We talk about that remnant and that remnant concept that, the majority is always going to be in one place, and it's often going to be this minority that's seeking to stand faithful and firm. The book of Revelation, the message that I get from it, and I took Revelation from a guy named Gerhard Krodel at the Lutheran Seminary. He was a Luftwaffe pilot in World War II, and he had interesting perspective on things. But he focused on this Christological message of Revelation, that here's, in a sense, John is trying to stir up trouble in his book. There was no empire-wide persecution under Domitian or others, as sometimes has been thought, but that it's like John was trying to poke the bear by telling people to be faithful, but also emphasizing, people are crying out, souls under the altar are crying out, how long, O Lord, are you going to abandon us? How long are we going to be suffering? When are you going to actually get around to keeping your promise? And the book of also has that theme of comfort, that Christ is with us, that he's the one who's interceding for us, that he's coming back to judge for us, that the judgment is to overturn those powers that oppress, that hurt, and to bring his hurting, traumatized people to this land flowing with milk and honey. That's the hope that we can have. And in the midst of that hope, we look for we draw strength from fellow believers, and from this unity of the faith that we share. And I pray that God will continue groups like this, that you can find fellowship, that you can be encouraged, that you are not alone. That Elijah, you're weary from fighting the battle, thinking you're alone, and that word of God that says, no, there's 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal, that you are not alone. So may God
thank you,
bless
Bill. This has been just a really very rich presentation and conversation. I'm deeply blessed by it, and thank you. And I want to just mention to you before you all leave here that next week we're having Professor Jody Washburn from Walla Walla University. She's going to be here talking about trauma in Scripture. And I told her we haven't addressed issues of trauma and PTSD and things like that in this class. So it'll be a very pastoral sort of approach to how we deal with those who have trauma. And some of that trauma, to be honest, Bill, as you mentioned and I mentioned today, is religious trauma. Churches can also hurt people, sometimes more than they help them, I fear. Thank you so much, and
Lawrence,
goodbye, everybody. Yeah.
Lawrence, if I just suggest a couple of readings towards that end. A friend of mine, another one I met with last week, David Peters, is a retired Army chaplain, and he wrote 2 books, one called Post-Traumatic God and one called Post-Traumatic Jesus. One is the post-traumatic God is how our view of God can change based on trauma, and post-traumatic Jesus that just came out is reading the New Testament through that lens of people that have been suffering, and Jesus is one who did suffer trauma and what his message of hope is. So those are 2 great resources that I can recommend, again, by David W. Peters.
David W. Peters?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have the link, but I did just post right now the name of the 2 books. Post-Traumatic God, Post-Traumatic Jesus by David W. Peters.